Welcome to the Bible 101, our monthly class on the overview of the Bible. My name is Eric Williams, and I'm the rector of St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Rochester, Michigan. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this class. We meet in person once a month. This month's session is called the Hebrew Bible Part 1, and it's part of our series, which began in September with how the Bible was written, and then last month, the history in and behind the Bible. And so we're going to look at the Hebrew Bible, what we used to call the Old Testament, in a couple of sessions this month and next month. These videos will be available anytime on our website as well. But if you want to join us in person, we'll be meeting November 21st and then again in December. You can see next year the different sessions as we move into the Apocrypha and then into the New Testament as well. We hope you can join us for some of those in-person classes where we have cookies and coffee in addition to me droning on. But as I said, you can also watch these online at your convenience. So when we talk about the Hebrew Bible, and we mentioned this in our first session, the Hebrew word for this is Tanakh, which is an acronym made from three letters, T, N, and K, are the English equivalents from the Hebrew. Torah is the first, T, which literally means instruction or law. And that will be our focus for this session today. And then next month, we'll look at the other two parts of the Hebrew Bible, the Nevi'im, that's the N, meaning prophets, and the Ketuvim, which means writings, which includes all the more sort of philosophical and interesting books towards the end of the Hebrew Bible. So just to be clear, today we're focused in on the Torah, which is the heart of the Hebrew Bible, the essence of Jewish faith and life, and the foundation for Christian faith and life as well. In the Jewish tradition, first, the Torah, in the narrowest sense, refers to the first five books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But in a broader sense, when you say Torah, it can include all of Jewish law and tradition as well. By tradition, the Torah, these first five books, were given to Moses in written form with oral commentary. And the oral Torah, the Mishnah, is that oral tradition and commentary, which was first written down in the 2nd century of the Common Era. And so the Talmud is another great word you should know from Judaism, which is additional commentary. So if you were a rabbinical student, for example, you'd be studying the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and you would see on a page, there'd be a little bit of the original Bible passage in the middle, and then around that would be the Mishnah, that first layer of commentary, and then around that would be the Talmud, the additional commentary. So in Judaism, there is a conversation with the Bible. We are always in the midst of arguing with and talking to and trying to understand these texts. And I really like that as a way of approaching the Bible for Christians as well, as we try to wrestle with and understand these very ancient texts, which have so much meaning for us even today, but often take a little bit of wrestling in order to come to conclusions. So one of the questions, that comes about is, well, by tradition, Moses wrote the Torah. Either he wrote it or he received it from God. And this is in Exodus 31. God gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone written by the finger of God. And so we have this tradition that Moses received the 10 Commandments written by the finger of God. It's very evocative. But nowhere in the Bible does it say that he actually wrote a book on the mountain or came down with one. There's no reference to a Bible until much, much, much later. And in fact, I've often pointed out, if Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, he also wrote about his own death, because at the end of Deuteronomy, it says, "And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said." So clearly somebody else was writing at least that sentence. And in fact, from really early on, at least from the Middle Ages, scholars, rabbis began to believe that actually this wasn't all written by Moses, that there was more than one author. In the 19th century, German scholars began to apply some of the techniques of literary criticism to the Bible. They were studying literature and picking it apart. You know, if you've ever studied English in college, you know how you get things picked apart. Well, these scholars began to study the Bible as a work of literature as well, looking at the word usage, the forms of the writing, and they noticed some interesting inconsistencies in the Torah in these first 5 books. For example, there are different names for God. In fact, in our first class, we talked about a lot of the different names that have been used for about God in the Hebrew Bible. But they noticed that there were some interesting ways in which the name of God was used. So Elohim, which gets translated in English Bibles as God, seemed to be a very important word, a name for God. And then Yahweh, which was spoken by Jews as Adonai, the Lord, was also very prominent. And there were other names as well. And as they looked at these names, they began to see some interesting things going on, such that they came up with a theory that, in fact, there were different writers, and those different writers could be understood or seen in the way they use the name of God and other quirks about their writing and style and theology. So in this theory that was first promulgated in the 19th century by these German scholars and has now really become very well and widely accepted among biblical scholars all over. The first of these sources was called J. J, because God is referred to as Yahweh, and in German, the first letter of Yahweh is J, not Y, so that's why it's J. We get the word Jehovah from that. And so the theory was that this writer was writing in the southern kingdom of Judah after the division of the kingdom in 922 BCE, perhaps as late as the 8th century. So this is someone who had a close kind of relationship to that period of the monarchy in Hebrew history that we studied about last month. This source contains the traditions of the Davidic monarchy. So this is someone who is really trying to pass on the learnings, the wisdom, and the point of view of the Davidic monarchy and the establishment of Jerusalem as the center of worship, the temple being the place where worship was supposed to be held, as well as recounting the history, the ancient history of the people of Israel as a people under God's guidance. And this writer is characterized not so much by legalism, but more of an epic story, an epic history, an epic narrative of the sweeping journey of the people of Israel throughout time. So that's the first source according to this theory. And we'll look at how these actually play out in some of the actual stories. The second major source was called E, because that name for God, Elohim, which begins with E, was used throughout this writer. And the idea here is that where J was in the southern kingdom, Jerusalem and Judah, E was riding up in Israel in the northern kingdom, and perhaps started sooner than J, maybe before the establishment of the monarchy, though it could be really around the same time as J, the 8th century BCE. And different focus. So rather than a lot of kind of support of the Davidic monarchy, what E is writing about is the older traditions of the conquest of the land by the 12 tribes of Israel, and really a focus about the covenant and a mention of places like the hills, the high places in the northern kingdom where people were worshiping, not in the temple, but in these other places. And so you can see that these different writers are really reflecting different aspects of the people and the locations and times in which they were placed. The third major source, according to this theory, is called D because it is the Deuteronomic material. As we mentioned before, that's the second law. Deuteronomy means second law. And this has all kinds of interesting pieces. It contains some of the traditions of Moses, but probably gets written down during the reign of Josiah. If you remember from our history class, Josiah, according to this Deuteronomic history, was the greatest of the kings of Israel because Josiah returned the people to the worship of God and restored a kind of sense of moral and spiritual centeredness, reformed the monarchy, reformed the kingdom, reinstituted religious practices. And so probably that's when this book gets written because it's much, much later than the original laws of Moses. Now it's been reformed and rewritten in the book of Deuteronomy. So that's why, for example, Deuteronomy has another story about the Ten Commandments, which was first written down in Exodus, but there's also a version in Deuteronomy because maybe they had lost the book of Exodus. Maybe this was the restatement of that. A later version of Deuteronomy was re-edited after the exile and really was an attempt to kind of rethink religion. Remember that crisis of the exile? They had to kind of reimagine their religion without the temple, without Jerusalem, without their homeland. And so Deuteronomy becomes an important part. And the Deuteronomic history, I should say, it's not just the book of Deuteronomy. There's other stuff as well. So it's Deuteronomy, it's parts of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, parts of Jeremiah are all considered part of this Deuteronomic history. Some of the themes of this are faithfulness to God with those covenant traditions and obedience. And remember, we had that very formulaic, the people follow God and then they're rewarded and then they fall away from God and they're punished until a hero rises up. The book of Judges is really part of all this material as well. But it's really concerned with obedience to God, faithfulness to God's law. That's a hallmark of this source, Deuteronomic, or just D for short. And the last one that we'll talk about is P. This is considered the priestly writings. And this was really concerned with how are we going to do worship in the temple? So this is really centered around, I often call this, I think of the book of Leviticus being a huge part of the P material, which I often joke is an altar guild manual for the temple. But that's kind of the flavor of the priestly material. How are we supposed to worship? What kinds of sacrifices and how much? And it's very detail-oriented, precise types of writing and how to observe the festivals and how to do the genealogies, statistics. When you start seeing a lot of very specific dates and times and amounts and so forth, you realize you're probably dealing with the priestly writer here. This priestly writer is probably, it's not certain, but probably the editor that pulls together J, E, and D and finishes the Torah, the first 5 books, and gives it its final edited version. And so we'll see how that also was a huge important task because that's what carried the people of Israel forward was this Torah, these first 5 books. And so it was really important to have them in a kind of finished form. So let's take a peek. I'm going to share a different screen here. Let's take a peek. There's a couple places where you can really vividly see how these different sources are telling the same story in a different way. The first one, which we're not going to look at in this class, but I'll just mention it, is there are 2 creation stories in Genesis. There is Genesis 1, goes to the very beginning of chapter 2, and there's Genesis 2 that begins at the 4th verse. And they're very different stories. Like the first chapter of Genesis is all about how God created the heavens and the earth, right? Day 1, the separating the waters, right? The waters of chaos and creating light. And then there's the different plants and then the animals. And it's very specific, detail-oriented types of writing. And so very clearly, Genesis 1 is written by the priestly writer. But then the whole tone shifts in chapter 2 when we get to the creation of Adam and Eve. And suddenly we're not talking about numbers and days and all that. We're just talking about a story about how God cast Adam into sleep and took a rib and made Eve out of him. And suddenly it's not Elohim anymore, it's Yahweh that we're talking about. And so Genesis chapter 2 is the J writer. And those two versions, the priestly writer takes their own version, which either was E or P, we're not sure exactly, of chapter 1, and doesn't want to get rid of it, and then has chapter 2, a very different story, and just says, well, we'll just put them together. We'll just keep both, which is kind of the editorial principle by which P is working. This, whatever different stories we've received, we're just going to mush them together. And it's one of the reasons, honestly, why the Bible can be somewhat confusing to read, because we have these different stories and we suddenly lurch into a different version of the story, and it can be a little discombobulating. So, but let's take a look at another story from Genesis, which shows this also pretty clearly, and that is the story of Noah. So here we have the story of Noah from Genesis chapters 6 through 8. And helpfully, what an editor has done is to pry these two versions apart. So remember I said they're smushed together. Well, here someone has taken the time to go through and figure that out. And how do they do that? They did that based on this four-source theory, with the understanding that for the J writer, the Yahwist, that the name Yahweh would be used for God. And for the priestly writer, the name God, Elohim, would be used. Also like E. It's a little confusing between P and E sometimes. But basically, we believe the priestly writer is the author of this because we'll see in a second the details that are listed in that story. And so as we read down through these, what's fascinating is although we've pulled them apart from one narrative, they actually make two coherent stories. You can read through the Yahwist version and it makes sense. It coheres as a story. And you can do the same with the P version. And that's evidence for this source theory, that there are really two different stories that were woven together. So what are the differences? The Yahwist, the J writer, tends to write this as an epic story with more general kind of descriptions. And so we have the story of Yahweh being unhappy with the wickedness of people and deciding to wipe them out. Yahweh is personified here. Yahweh speaks to Noah, and they kind of interact in a very human way. And then we see numbers. So the numbers that the J writer tends to use are symbolic numbers. There's always like 7 or 40, right? There are 40 years in the wilderness and 40 days and 40 nights. Well, here there will be rain for 7 days, or in 7 days, there'll be rain for 40 days and 40 nights. That's just a long time, a good long time. That's how to understand that. And as we go through this story, at the end of the time of the rain, the waters begin to recede. And at the end of the 40 days, Noah opened the window and he sent out a dove. So in the J version, it's 40 days of rain and it's a dove that is sent out afterwards. So to compare that to the P version goes right away into genealogy, which is a prime example of P writing, and in more specificity about how things are going. So these are the descendants of Noah. So you're in the P version when you read about the descendants. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In the P version, the earth is corrupt, because of violence and bloodshed. It is ritual purity. So remember, the P writer is really writing about temple sacrifice and so forth. A prime theological issue for the P writer is purity, the purity of the people of Israel. And one of the ways to be ritually impure is to commit violence or to touch the dead body or to have bloodshed. And so now the whole earth gets corrupted because of all the bloodshed. And so God commands Noah to make an ark. And here's, unlike the J version, here's some more detail. It's got to be cypress wood. It's got to have rooms. It's going to be covered with pitch. It's going to be 300 cubits long by 50 cubits wide by 30 cubits high. It's going to have a roof. The roof's going to be a cubit above. A door is going to be on the side. There's going to be lower, second, and third decks. And you get the idea of the P sort of detail here. And then what's also interesting is you're going to bring everything in, all the animals into the ark, and they're going to be almost like the story of Genesis chapter 1. That's how we're kind of thinking about the animals that are coming 2 by 2 into the ark. It also tells us how old Noah is. He's 600 years old. There's clean animals, which are kosher animals, as well as non-kosher animals. They're all coming onto the ark. And then here we get specific dates. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of that month, on that day, the rain started, and they all went in. At the end of the rain, which goes on in this story for 150 days. So you see, one of the hallmarks also of these two different versions is there's conflict. If you're reading along and you're like, wait, the rain was 40 days and 40 nights, all of a sudden it's 150 days, what gives? You know, you're probably in the realm of two different versions of the story. And that's a really important insight. And that's one of the clues that these German scholars had, that there were different stories being told. In this version of the story, the bird that is sent out to look for dry land is not a dove, but it's a raven. And so there are just all these discrepancies, the different length of time of rain, the different bird, the way the story is told with more specificity or less, the reason for the flood, all these little subtle differences or not so subtle differences lead us to see that these are two different stories. I got to tell you, I found this really fascinating when I encountered it in seminary. And for me, it does not take away from the importance of the Bible. In fact, it enriches it for me. It shows me how these different people in different places at different times were trying to pass on the Word of God in this way. And they did it in these really fascinating ways that reflected their circumstances, their theology, their understanding as they went on. And I think it helps us to read this story in a different way. I'm amused by, some of you may have been there. There is, I think in Tennessee, a recreation of Noah's Ark according to the Bible. I didn't ask which version. In fact, I think the guy in Tennessee wouldn't believe there were more versions than just the one. But he's tried to faithfully recreate the ark based on this story. And to me, that's really not the purpose. The purpose of this story is to help us to understand something about our relationship with God and how the people of God were able to overcome this terrible tragedy or punishment from God and to endure. So that leads us back to looking at the Torah as a whole. So when we go and look at the Torah as a whole, what we see is basically the story that's being told throughout the whole of the 5 books of the Torah are answering the question, how did things get to be like this? Hey, Dad, why? Hey, Grandpa, why are things the way they are? And so let me tell you a story. And that's what the Torah really is about. It's an epic story, according to the J version, especially the creation, the flood, the patriarchs, the tribes, slavery, Exodus, conquest. All of these are telling the epic story of the origins of the people of Israel. This is who we are. This is where we came from. This is what we went through. It's in a way what you would tell, hopefully, your children and grandchildren about your own story. Hey, I love telling my own kids that, my dad came from Wales during the Great Depression, and we were able to travel there some years ago when the girls were little. We got to visit the towns where my grandmother and grandfather were born. We got to see the place where their house was. We got to see the cemetery where some of their relatives, some of our relatives are buried. We got to go to South Wales and to see the coal mine where my grandfather had worked before they emigrated. We got to go to New York and to see where my dad had lived, and to Buffalo where my mom was from. And all these things are a way of helping your kids know who they are based on the story, the epic story of your particular family. In a way, you could look at the Bible as just a bigger version of this, the epic story of the people of Israel being told and passed on to the next generations. It's also answering the question of what is the relationship between Israel and itself as a people, Israel and God, Israel and the other nations, and Israel and the land. All of these factor very much into the story that's told in the Torah. How shall we worship? That's Leviticus. Where shall we live? What laws shall we have? How are we to govern ourselves? All of these questions are explored and answered, sometimes in contradictory ways, in these 5 books and from these 4 sources that we talked about. So we're going to take a quick break. If you want to pause this and stretch, we're going to come back, and what we're going to do is very quickly look book by book through the books of the Torah. And I want to give a shout out to Jeff Krantz, who put this wonderful material together on a website called overviewbible.com. There's a ton of other resources. I can give you some books to look at, or you can look up stuff online as well. There's a lot of great resources for studying the Bible. But if you want to pause this, take a quick coffee break, and then come back. We're going to whip through the books of the Torah and give you a kind of a flavor of each of those books. All right, obviously, in the beginning is Genesis, right? That's how it starts. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and it really is the epic, almost mythological story of the creation. A hallmark of this is from Genesis chapter 17. The great theme of Genesis is covenant, that God's relationship with Israel, with humanity, is through a covenant, a sacred contract, terms of which God will abide by, and often humans won't, and we'll see how that plays out. But this is the line. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God, and the God of your descendants after you. This is the promise that God makes to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, renews with Moses, fulfills in Jesus. Covenant is the heart of the theological understanding of the relationship of God and humanity. In chapters 1 to 11 in Genesis, we get the story of Adam and Eve, the creating of the heavens and the earth. So as I talked about, there's the 2 versions of creation. In chapter 2, God places Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, but they rebel against God, introducing a curse of sin and death to the world. This is, again, answering the question, hey, why do we have to work so hard to feed ourselves? And why is everything so difficult? Well, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, we had it great at the Garden of Eden, and we messed up, and now we got to work in the field in the hot sun to make our living. Adam and Eve have children, including Cain and Abel. Those children have children, and eventually, as we mentioned in that Noah story, the world becomes so violent that God sends a great flood to purify the world, not to destroy it really, but to purify it. And he spares the one righteous man, Noah, the only one he can find. And Noah builds his famous ark and takes his family and the animals onto the ark. And then when the ark comes to dry ground after the waters recede, God promises to never again destroy the earth with a flood, puts the rainbow in the heavens as a sign of that covenant that God will never again destroy the earth with a flood. This part of Genesis culminates with the strange story of the Tower of Babel. The people of the earth come together. They haven't learned their lesson from the flood, so they come together to make a great city and a name for themselves, right? They're feeling their oats. And at this time, God and the divine beings with him, angels, other gods, it's a little confusing in the story, are upset that the people are building this tower because the people want to become God. They want to climb up to heaven and basically usurp God and become gods. So they scatter the people, they confuse their languages, and they set up different nations. Again, answering the question, hey, Dad, how come there's all these different countries and everybody talks a different language? That doesn't make any sense. How did that happen? Well, son, grandson, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, we all spoke the same language, but then we got too proud and we tried to take over from God, and God scattered us and made us different nations with different languages. This is a story told in Genesis 11, and then it's repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 32. The next section of Genesis is really the story of God and Israel, the patriarch story. So Act 1, Abram, who's minding his own business in Ur, is called by God to leave his family and his land and journey to the land of Canaan. God promises to bless Abram with many descendants and to bless all the nations of the world through him. And so Abram believes God's promise. That's the great act of the leap of faith of Abram. Even though he is old and childless and his wife is past childbearing years, they are blessed with a son, Isaac. Abram's name is changed because of his covenant with God from Abram to Abraham. That's often something that happens in the Torah. Someone has a relationship with God and they change their name to reflect their new identity. So Jacob becomes Israel because he wrestles with the angel. We'll see that in a second. So Abraham and Sarah have a son, Isaac. Chapters 25 to 36, the story of Isaac and Jacob, the next two generations of this patriarchal family. 25 to 27 is the story of Isaac, who dwells in the land of Canaan. He has two boys, Jacob and Esau. Jacob grows up, tricks Esau into giving away his blessing. Esau is not too happy about this. So in chapters 28 to 36, Jacob leaves town to go live with his uncle. He decides it's safer to get out of Esau's way. He marries, has 13 children, and lives with his uncle for 20 years. There's some great details in that story before God calls him back to Canaan. And then he wrestles with the angel. He has this encounter with God, and his name is changed to Israel in chapter 35. The next generation of the story is the great story of Joseph, which really brings to an end the story of Genesis. This is Act 4 of the patriarchal story and takes these 14 chapters. Of all of Jacob's children, his 12 sons and one daughter, Joseph is his favorite, right? He gets the amazing Technicolor dream coat. His brothers are jealous. They sell him into slavery. He becomes a prisoner in Egypt. But he is blessed by God with the ability to interpret dreams. And so eventually he is rescued out of the dungeons and becomes a favorite of the Pharaoh, even becoming the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. Because of his position and because of his ability to interpret dreams, he is able to warn Pharaoh that a famine is coming and prudently stockpiles food for the coming years. Joseph's predictions are correct. The famine reaches all the way to Canaan, and so his father and brothers are starving. They come to Egypt to try to buy food. Joseph plays a little trick on them, but eventually reconciles with them. They're shocked to find out that he has survived and that he is so powerful. He welcomes them to Egypt, and they all lived happily ever after until Exodus. The book of Exodus is the great epic story of the rescue of the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt and their journey through the wilderness and ultimately right up to but not into the promised land by the end of this book. The theme of this is the Exodus, the rescue. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. This is the defining story in many ways for the people of Israel. Act 1, God hears Israel. So Exodus picks up where Genesis leaves off. The people of Israel are living in Egypt, right? They're prosperous, they're happy, they're growing, but a new Pharaoh comes to power, and he is worried about this growing power base of Hebrews, and so he decides to enslave them. Under Egyptian law, the Pharaoh owned everybody and everything, so he enslaves them, and he also orders that the Hebrew sons should be cast into the Nile at birth. But one baby survives. Moses is able to be rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. He grows up as a prince of Egypt. And later on in his life, he sees his fellow countrymen, the Hebrews, being abused as slaves. He kills an Egyptian slave driver and is forced to flee into the country. He meets God there in the wilderness in the form of the burning bush, and his life is changed forever as he is sent by God to go back to Egypt and to declare God's message to Pharaoh. Chapter 7 to 18, Moses with his brother Aaron confront Pharaoh on God's behalf. Let my people go. You know that old spiritual, we sing it often. Pharaoh refuses, his heart is hardened, and so God sends the famous plagues upon the Egyptians. None of them are able to change his heart until the last plague, which kills his son. And he finally allows Israel to leave. The Israelites celebrate the first ever Passover, as the angel of death passes over them, and then they set out into the wilderness. Pharaoh quickly changes his mind, sends the army to recapture them. God saves Israel miraculously by parting the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, as we saw in our prior class, and allowing Israel to escape their would-be captors, and then uses the sea to wash away Pharaoh's army. Act 3, another covenant. God makes a covenant with the people of Israel. As the Israelites leave Egypt, they journey to Mount Sinai, where God gives his laws to Moses, those 10 commandments. God makes a covenant with the nation of Israel and the generations to come. Because he rescued them from Egypt, Israel is to observe all of God's laws. God speaks the 10 commandments directly to the whole nation of Israel, and he relays specific ordinances to Moses on the mountain, all those laws that are captured in the book of Exodus. But already things aren't going as planned. Even while God is giving Moses the laws for the people down at the bottom of the mountain are worshiping the golden calf. Not cool. Moses pleads with God on Israel's behalf, and the nation is given a second chance, another opportunity to try to keep God's commands. From 35 to 40, God dwells with Israel. God does not stop just with the list of rules. God gives instructions for Moses to build a tabernacle, a special tent of worship in which the Ark of the Covenant and the 10 Commandments will be located as a symbol of God's living presence with the people. The book of Exodus ends with the glory of the Lord filling the tabernacle. God is now dwelling among his chosen people, Israel, and the next book will go on to document all the laws that God gives his people on Mount Sinai. So the next book is Leviticus. This is written by the priestly writer, as I mentioned. It's about a lot of details about temple worship. What's fascinating is this is all supposed to be happening way before there's a temple, right? The people are still wandering through the wilderness, but Leviticus is really about the much later worship of God in the temple. And the theme of this is holiness and purity. Thus you are to be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from all the peoples to be mine. That's the theme of this priestly writer in Leviticus. So the themes are holiness and purity. God is holy, so the people must be holy as well. And living into holiness means living in a manner that respects the presence of God. And that really means religious purity. And it's really a kind of obsession with the book of Leviticus. There's many sections and chapters to this. Chapters 1 through 7 are how to give offerings. In 8 through 10, we have Aaron and his sons ordained as priests. And then 11 through 15, there are purity and cleanliness laws for the congregation. In 16 to 17, we get really the first description of what later becomes a really important theological concept of atonement. So what happens when you sin, when you're ritually impure, you have to be made right, and you do that through sacrifice. And so that becomes a hallmark of Jewish theology and later on of Christian theology as well. And then in chapters 18 to 27, how to be a holy culture. Okay, so you got all these laws, but how are you going to embody the holiness of God in the people? That's enough on Leviticus for now. We can go into much greater depth if you would like. The book of Numbers is a really fascinating book as well. It really is telling the story of the time in the wilderness. And the theme here is the people's stubbornness and unfaithfulness. So if Leviticus is all about how they're supposed to be pure and holy, Numbers is how they fall short. And so here we have from chapter 14, the Lord said to Moses, "How long will this people spurn me? How long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst?" So chapters 1 through 10, we get the preparation to leave Sinai. This begins with a census. Moses is taking a census. And that's why actually the book is called Numbers, because they're numbering the people. Israel has been camping in the wilderness for about a year, and it's time for them to get moving. So they got the law, and now it's time to go. He gives them orders for how the 12 tribes should position themselves as they camp and as they move through the wilderness, with the tabernacle of God being in the center. That's that tent where the Ark of the Covenant and the Ten Commandments are. And a good deal of the new laws, rituals, and sacrifices take place in these chapters. From chapter 10 to 19, we have a little interlude from Sinai to Paran. There's some pretty awful stuff that happens in Numbers. The people are constantly whining and complaining. And so God is upset and sends fire and a plague. Moses' brother, Aaron, and his sister Miriam, they speak out against Moses. And so Miriam gets cursed with leprosy. I got to say, not great. These are chapters we rarely read. Like they never come up in church because we tend to want to gloss over some of these stories. Act 2 here is Israel rejects the land. So this is chapters 13 to 19. Once the people get halfway to Canaan, Moses sends spies to scope it out. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, tell the people that the land is good and God will give it to them. The other 10, however, have no confidence that they can take the land. They believe the forces protecting Canaan outmatch Israel. And this does not go over well. The people are not happy to hear this news that they're going to get slaughtered if they go into the promised land. So they turn on Moses. They refuse to go in and take the land. And so God says to them, "All right, you get your wish. You will all die in the wilderness, and I will only give it to your children." God comes across as very cranky in the book of Numbers, and the people come across as very angry and stubborn as well. It's what might you say, a somewhat dysfunctional relationship throughout this part of the Bible. From 20 to 36, we get another interlude. Things get a little worse before they get better. Moses disobeys God in front of the people. He strikes the rock when he's not supposed to. He too is prohibited. Even the great Moses will not be allowed to enter the promised land. Aaron dies. His son takes his place. Israel is fighting different enemies along the way in the wilderness, and they end up just across the Jordan River from Canaan in the plains of Moab. They can see the promised land. They're just waiting. And so Numbers 22 to 36, Israel makes camp across the Jordan River from Jericho. Yes, that Jericho, the Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. They're a force to be reckoned with now. They've defeated some enemies and armies, and a few of the tribes begin settling on the east side of the Jordan. As you can imagine, the surrounding nations are pretty freaked out. They hire a guy named Balaam to curse Israel, which does not work out. Because remember, God's promise to Abraham that they will be a blessing. Balaam gets a different nation to send in their daughters to seduce the Israelites and get them to worship other gods. This doesn't end well for Israel at first. That causes yet another plague, but it's an even worse deal for the other nation. 5 of their rulers and Balaam are killed. There's yet another census. Joshua is named Moses' successor, and generally speaking, the whole nation is made ready for this next chapter. They're about to enter the promised land. After a whole generation of wandering in the wilderness, they're just about ready, but not just yet. Moses has a very important message for them, but it has to wait for Deuteronomy. So the last book of the Torah is Deuteronomy. We talked about this being the part of the Deuteronomic history, which was probably written more in the time of Josiah. But the theme of Deuteronomy is really about faithfulness to God again, a kind of reiteration of the covenant, the new law, Deuteronomy, second law. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants. How? By loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, and holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. That promise so long ago is now being fulfilled. Finally, Israel is just across the Jordan River from the land of Canaan, the promised land. Moses has led the young nation out of Egypt and on this 40-year journey through the wilderness, and they have just defeated several enemies. They're gathered. 3 of the 12 tribes are already settling east of the Jordan, and the whole nation is packed and ready to go. The last time Israel was this close, they doubted God's promise and tried to go back to Egypt. Because of their unbelief, God had banned them from ever entering the promised land, causing them to wander for the 40 years. Now the old generation has died, and the new nation is about to claim the land. But Moses rallies them to remind them of God's law and why they should obey him. This is how the book gets its name, the second giving of God's law. So chapters 1 through 3 are a recap of Israel's journey from Egypt. 4 through 10 is a recap of Israel's relationship with God. Remember, this is kind of reiterating the story and the promises. 11 through 26, how to love God and keep the commandments. Blessings, curses, and restoration. And then finally, at the end of the book, the death of Moses. That is the Torah. It's the great saga of the people of Israel from the creation of the universe all the way through to the death of Moses. It includes lots of different elements from different time periods, all kind of jumbled in there and mixed in. But it's really the epic story of the people of Israel and the themes of the covenant with God, purity and holiness, how to worship, how to act, how to be. All of that is covered in these essential core books of Jewish and Christian faith and life. So I invite your questions. If you're watching this on YouTube and I'm not with you, feel free to email me. My email is on the page here. You're always welcome to reach out, and I'll be happy to answer your questions in a future video or to respond to you directly. And I hope that you'll join us again for another installment of the Bible 101. Next month, we'll be talking about the more of the Hebrew Bible, the prophets, and the writings, those great philosophical writings. So stay tuned for that. We'll have that posted on the church website, and the class will be December 19th. I hope you can join us online or in person. God bless.